Hello, everybody. My name is Dorota Michulka. I come from the University of Wrocław, from Polish Studies Department, from Poland. And I would like to present today the paper, which is titled "In Looking for Identity, the Poetics of Misunderstandings in Polish Adolescent Fiction in the late of 20th and the early 21st centuries." Theoretical background, axiology and power. Contemporary young adult literature, here realistic novels of manners, has developed a new type of hero for the consumer society, a representative of the generation nobody, who is in the state of communicative and axiological confusion. The young adult prose of the late 20th and early 21st centuries referred to as literature of anthropological sensitivity or literature of initiation, creates images of a difficult reality surrounding the children of the next generations. It prompts the principles of the game of values and the search for the lost order and self. It highlights the theme of meeting yourself in the labyrinth of values, attitudes, choices, patterns of behavior, and existential questions that you must try to answer on your own. It allows for ambiguous roles, models, shows the ethical complexity of the world, and provokes reflections and discussions. Grzegorz Leszczyński writes, "If we accept literary works as a source of knowledge about the reader, we need to recognize that the most distinct feature of today's youth is the perception of adolescence as suffering and of the time of spiritual growth and accumulation of experience as a situational boundary, as defined by Karl Jaspers." Current Codes considers analyze text for young adults as an, for example, Lacanian paradigm to identify contemporary adolescent literature as a site of working through the physical, psychic, and social abjection of the teenage body, seeking meaning and value in the culture that places that body in a liminal space between childhood protection and adult responsibility. Code writes, examples of need for interconnection, multiply perspectives, and mutuality abound through form, content, and intertextuality. The myth of atomistic liberal humanist self is being satisfactorily debunked in young adult literature. But the key player is more than not a figure who positions herself as a cultural outsider. Roberta Silinger-Trice, however, emphasizes that while adolescent literature may seem to be about growth, growth always takes place in the context of power. Who has it, who doesn't, and what must be negotiated in order for the adolescent to gain power in his or her culture. By exploring the relationship of teen protagonists within various institutions of cultural power, as well as the biological imperatives of sex and death, Trice views adolescent literature as the staging ground for power struggles where outcomes determine the ethics and delimit the possibilities for agency of the young adult as an actor in his or her world. We also refer here to the work of Robin McCallum and her ideologies of identity in adolescent fiction, the dialogic construction of subjectivity. Polish contemporary young adult novels dealing with axiological issues are deeply rooted in everyday reality, including social reality, and often highlight the problems of social stratification. They are also rooted in the realm of psychology. This novel describes the following issues: dysfunctional families, divorces, the crisis of fatherhood and motherhood, pathologies, images of children as Euro-orphans, a generation devoid of values, integration and sense of identity, existential loneliness, uncertainty, lack of stability, images of mentally and spiritually homeless children, addiction problems, contacts with the underworld, and the generation seeking thrills such as alcohol, drugs, and sex. Characters and narration from projection to identification. A teenage hero, adrift in life, becomes entangled in difficult intergenerational dialogues, which often result in communication failures, disagreements with adults, for example, severing relationships with family, and social isolation. Conflicts between the characters, especially in the case of children and adults, are caused by, among the others, lack of acceptance, lack of empathy on the part of the parent, indifference, misinterpretation of the intention of the speaker, and atrophy of the willingness and ability to feel compassion, use of inappropriate different language codes. I will quote here from the book Fanfic by Natalia Osińska. We have here as an example of a dialogue between father and his daughter Tosia. Have you read anything interesting lately? Father asked. A puzzled look of the sleepy eyes. Yes, and I'm preg about Fiero. Pardon? It was a crossover, added Tosia with some excitement, from the Avengers universe. Fiero was a superhero there, and he was friends with Tony Stark. Is this some book? Asked Marcin, the father, trying very hard to show interest in the topic. No, what does it mean? It's like a story within the fandom. Tosia replied patiently. It was a fanfic. Who wrote it? Tosia shrugged. I don't know, some girl from the States. Do you read in English? Asked Marcin in despair. You bet, muttered Tosia. It's hard to find good slash about wicked in Polish. I see, replied Marcin. That is good. He added without much conviction. At least you get to know the language. I refer here to the concept of interpersonal communication, which is a multifaceted phenomenon where communication behavior is an expression of the human value system or of an individual. And I refer here to narratological perspective, including cognitive perspective, with particular emphasis on the poetics of intersubjectivity. Strategies of narration. The value of the narrative strategies of these novels resulting from misunderstandings in communication between the characters, its focus on the mind of the child and youth heroes and reflection of their inner state with emotional tensions. For example, through thoughts, mental images, imaginative patterns, and sensual experiences. A second, exploration of the limited slice of reality recorded in the character's individual experience. And the third, introduction of a self-reflective type of narrative. For example, the heroines and heroes write letters to themselves and keep diaries and blogs. All three narrative techniques mentioned above have an impact on the emotional involvement of the reader and the experiential nature of reading. They provoke empathic reading, where the reader not only succumbs to, but also understands emotions. Also, experience of literature provides great possibilities for the so-called empathetic narrative, with its ability to recognize mental acts and determine patterns of access to someone else's experience, in which a conflict or disagreement reveals the emotions of the hero. Such acts of putting oneself in someone else's shoes allows a reader to feel immersion in the problems of the literary reality, which reflects often mimetically the non-literary real world. The empathetic narrative is structurally rooted in disruptions and communicative oppositions, as well as generational conflicts, frictions, and antagonisms. The poetics of misunderstandings implies various patterns of the narrative mind reading. They may be applied to contemporary Polish novels for young readers through three models of intersubjective narrative, like projection, a model of full access of the narrator in the inner states of the characters, simulation, which includes mainly literary representations of the most subjective perceived features of the inner state, and identification, which implies full narrative access to the content of the character's thoughts and inner dialogue in the character's consciousness. The most popular contemporary novels for teenagers can be divided into three groups. First, the good patterns and still reading popularity in Poland. It's like Catcher in the Rye by Salinger, The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, or 13 Reasons Why by Asher. So the good tradition. The second, difficult subjects and overcoming boundaries in the search for one's own identity in the 90s in Poland. So I would like to emphasize Miss Nobody by Tomek Tryzna, published in 1995, Magda Dots by Marta Fox, published in 1996, Taboo by Kinga Dunin, Heroine My Love by Anna Onichimowska, and others. And as a third group, the new models of the family, social context and social disparities, sexual orientations and violence. We can see in such books like The Golden Plated Fish by Barbara Kosmowska, published 2007, Fanfic by Natalia Osińska, published in 2016, Should Be Clean by Anna Cieplak, published in 2016, and for example, like Grains of Sand, published by Joanna Jagiełło in 2018. These novels show representations of an insight into someone else's experience, consisting of a gradual transition from intersubjectivity of thought, when the narrator has access to them, like in the novel, for example, Taboo by Kinga Dunin, to intersubjectivity of internal speech, when the narrator illuminates the individual's perspective of the feeling and or talking hero, like Bridge over Mississippi or The Touch of Butterfly and Fanfic, to more elemental intersubjectivity of bodily and psychophysical experiences, when the narrator relies on observation of the embodied mind, like, for example, Hummingbird Day and Bridge over Mississippi by Ewa Przybylska. For the purposes of today's presentation, I chose one novel written by Ewa Przybylska, The Bridge over Mississippi, published in 2012. The prose works of Ewa Przybylska represent a specific type of stylistically broken narrative reflecting the stream of consciousness and inner uncertainty of the characters. The writer is a graduate of philosophy and history. In the years of 1958 to 1964, she worked as an educator at the police emergency youth shelter. The characters of her books are neglected children, juvenile delinquents taken to an emergency youth shelter. The main topic is the violence and aggression prevailing among the youngsters. In 1997, her novel Hummingbird Day won an award of the Polish section of IBBY, while in 2013, The Bridge over Mississippi was chosen the book of the year in the young adult book category. Since 2016, this book has also been on the IBBY honor list. The Bridge over Mississippi is an impressionistic book with a distorted chronology of the events and a compound narrative structure. In some places, the narrative techniques are reminiscent of the prose of Henry James or Joseph Conrad. As a metaphor of unfriendliness, non-uniformity, and misunderstanding, the Book of Przybylska falls somewhere between a green mohawk and a fancy broad-brimmed hat. The 11-year-old Kuba manifests his separate world with his mohawk hairstyle, whereas Theodora, the old lady who is Kuba's friend from the neighborhood, wears a sophisticated hat to reflect the diversity of the adult reality. The novel is unique due to its narrative and plot structure. It strives to eliminate the omniscient narrator while emphasizing penetration into the mind of the hero in terms of projection, simulation, and identification. The narrator does not interfere. He avoids speaking out and making comments, and the reader assesses the credibility of the presented scenes. The narrative is fragmentary, sketchy, and broken, presented in the style of the stream of consciousness, with elements of the philosophical treatise. There are numerous nominal sentences and short phrases without epithets. The presentation of the events is direct and factual. The sentences are constructed in an informative, comprehensible, declarative, and reporting manner, which reinforces the authenticity of the message. The fragmentary description of the events results from somewhat blurry images. There are flashbacks from the past detached scenes. When rediscovered, they turn to be the next significant events of the life of Kuba. Comprehended by the boy and the reader, they form a complete picture of the boy's personality. This situation reveals the protagonist's existential uncertainty and the real reason of his mental isolation. For example, there is a significant moment when Kuba saves his mother from suicide. Also, there is an ambiguity surrounding the moment of his father's departure. It could be a suicide or an escape. Kuba, the young hero, is a taciturn and lonely individual, neglected and considered by neighbors to a scallywag and a street urchin. At the same time, the boy is a shrewd observer of life. He notices more because she sees the world from different perspectives. He looks at the events in the streets. He watches them from behind the bushes and from the balcony, thus discovering human lies and deceptions. His sense of security is enhanced by the friendship with the lonely Theodora, deceived by her closest family. Over time, the relationship develops into a deep emotional understanding. Kuba fights for freedom of the old woman. He protects her against being sent to a nursing home and reveals the truth about the attempt of the family to take over her apartment. The story by Przybylska provokes reflection on the power of values. It brings to mind the philosophical works of Polish Romantic poet Cyprian Kamil Norwid because it's filled with axiological anxiety and kind of narrative of silence. It's a revelatory story of the downfall of moral authorities and a poignant image of existential confusion. As in other works by the author, to fully understand the central idea of the novel, one must know the social and ethical context. For example, the environment and background solidarity, local community and working class are presented in the novel in opposition and contrast to the intelligentsia. They are shown here as an ethically soulless group, commercially minded and devoid of moral scruples. For example, the family of Theodora or the emotionally cold purported grandmother of Kuba, who is a scientist and have icy dispositions. Bridges and precipices are a dominant feature in the novel, acting as metaphors for fear and courage. The eponymous bridge over the Mississippi River may be a sign of both rescue and an agreement. The lack of agreement results from a kind of angst of the hero who senses danger and desperately strives not to be caught unawares. No adult sees unbridled inner goodness and longing for feelings in this boy battered by life. Here are relevant exemplifications of projection, simulation, and identification that appear in the novel Bridge over Mississippi by Przybylska, and I will read the fragment of the novel to show this structure of narration. The mother didn't want freedom when she climbed the sill. She wanted to forget. She was afraid of any truth. He couldn't never tell her about schoolyard or about this down below conflicts with Rudy, the boy. She would never believe that PE teacher was just fair when he hit someone on the head. He did it without anger. The class could tell apart bad words from good ones, even when the good ones sounded best. They sitting at their desks wouldn't be convinced. Each backyard has its own code, own wisdom, and own ears. She, Theodora, understood it. Mother, never. And here is another scene, a cry for empathy, confronting the attitudes of the heroes and the mental distance that separates them. In this passage, Kuba opens the door and lets in the purported grandmother. I quote, "She froze as if she saw the devil. She was ancient. She didn't like the green mohawk. She didn't like Kuba either. They stared at each other. Then she moved Kuba and the two suitcases. She appropriated the middle room. She looked back again at Kuba from the doorstep. That is a stupid idea, she said. Her voice was as cold as ice. If only she got furious, but no, she wouldn't bother. He came to hate her before she finished the sentence." The above text analysis confirmed the thesis that misunderstandings of generations, teenagers and their parents are deeply rooted in the field of psychology, with particular emphasis on concepts related to empathy. Attempts to establish an understanding, dialogue, interpersonal communication between adults and adolescents refer not only to the common world of values and shaping ethical attitudes, but also to the specific entry into the role of another human being, understanding themselves and the relationship of me, others. Pay attention to emotional engagement and a compassionate world. As a commentary, I quote, "Emotional reactions have an important interpersonal and intrapersonal function. In the reception of the literature, especially for young adults, important is the communicative value of emotions and their regulative function. They control the interest level and the tension intensity, facilitate physical reflexes of the reader, and govern literary anticipation through initiation of subconscious and pre-rational attitudes towards perceived events. The relation between the word, the mental image, and the emotion may be treated as a dynamic and multi-directional interaction of three mental codes that participate in the reading process, not necessarily dependent on the phase and linearity of realization or on direct and indirect language imagery. In the process from declarative and performative, implying actions, to emotive functions, it's visible here as an communication act. When analyzing and interpreting Przybylska's narrative, it's important to use the strategy of focalisation. The specific focus of narrative attention is called by narratology researcher Mickey Ball And she claims that it's in the relationship between seeing and what is seen perceived. The previous theories that characterize storytelling in narration did not distinguish between the vision by which given elements are presented and the voice that verbalizes the vision. These typologies did not establish a boundary between the one who looks and the one who speaks. And yet, both in fiction and in reality, it's possible for one person to express the vision of another. So there is something that is seen, and the seeing is at the same time told. With each seeing that is presented, the viewer can be manipulated, and consequently, it's very difficult to separate it from the emotions, not only those attributed to the focalizer and the character, but also those on the reader's side, which helps to understand the emotions and not just to succumb to them. This particular perspective of seeing links the concept of focalization to photography and film theory. The focalizer in the media function of narrator as a director working with camera takes into account changes in the narrative horizon, shows distances and close-ups, which can also affect the emotions involved in reception. The use of the concept of focalization seems justified in the analysis of the novels for young people at the turn of the 20th and 21st century, like in the prose of Przybylska, among other things due to the attempt to penetrate, get closer to the interior of the characters close up to the minds of the protagonists, like Get In, aiming at an authentic understanding of ethical and existential dilemmas of individual characters, provoking empathic reading, but also immersion in the problems of the literary reality, which reflects often mimetically external from literary a real world. And we are slowly coming to the conclusion. The teenage heroes from the novels discussed are outsiders who are in conflict with the world. They are lonely and axiologically confused, seemingly rebelling against the rules imposed by the world of adults and ostentatiously flouting the social norms. They are sometimes aggressive and ruthless in relations with their surroundings, but their destructive transgressiveness is the result of despair, loneliness, and perceived lack of dignity. However, despite these modern settings, their attitudes and expectations do not differ from those described in the traditional novel for teenagers. Like their literary predecessors, rebels of both sexes desperately seek understanding, acceptance, and intimacy. The analyzed novels, owing to their highlighting of generational antagonism, misunderstandings, and conflicts, as well as communicative disturbances, offer a kind of game of values inscribed in the text and the narrative potential, enabling penetration of the minds of young heroes. They perfectly fit into the current discussion on axiological and communicative sensitivity. They not only provoke reflection on human existence, but also allow readers to get used to the complexity of ethical issues, especially noticeable during adolescence. And on the last slide, we have references of this presentation. Thank you very much for attention.